for being in the audience. We were hoping for a few more people than this, but Friday afternoon is not a great time, is it? So I'm Gabriele Bammer. I'm a professor here at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's my great pleasure to welcome Michael O'Rourke, who's a professor of philosophy at Mississippi State University. He's also in the Faculty of Ag Bio Research and Environmental Science Policy. And he's the Executive Director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, which we're going to spend a bit of time talking about. And this is a research and practice group that focuses on philosophical approaches to facilitating cross-disciplinary research. His primary research into interdisciplinary theory, epistemology, communication, and epistemic integration in collaborative cross-disciplinary research. His visit to Australia has been sponsored by the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, and his visit at the ANU has been co-sponsored between the Integration and Implementation Sciences Program here at NCEPH and the ANU Agri-Food Innovation Institute. So I should just say, by way of opening, that Michael's a philosopher and he's also very jet-lagged. So getting him to stop talking is more of a problem than getting him to start talking. So if you see me kicking him, I've asked him to keep the questions short because we've got a small group. I'm hoping we can have a pretty interactive session. But if you see me kicking him, that explains why. And he's got a good sense of humour, fortunately. So what I wanted to do is to take you on a bit of a journey through the work that Michael has done, which has been really quite stunning. He's been really adept at taking philosophical concepts and understandings of inter and transdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity and turning them into practical products that people can use to make teams work better. And that's really what we want to explore today. So, Michael, I might get you to start by saying a little bit about where this, using as a starting point the IGOT program, because I think that was a really seminal moment. Mm-hmm. So, have a microphone.
Right. So, yeah, my father used to accuse me of liking to hear myself talk. So, I appreciate the encouragement to keep it short. So, the work that we do in a nutshell is focused on building collaborative capacity in cross-disciplinary research and practice teams. So we have used philosophical concepts and methods to structure dialogues that help collaborators from heterogeneous disciplinary backgrounds or community backgrounds identify ways in which they're similar and ways in which they're different. And this is an approach we call the toolbox dialogue method. It originated in a project at the University of Idaho that was funded by the National Science Foundation in the US, Integrative Graduate Education and Research Traineeship project, or program rather. It was one of their projects, an IGOT project. And that program was designed to encourage graduate education that was interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. So provide graduate students with an opportunity to do meaningful integrative work long before it was typical to do that. Typically in the US, you move into interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work after getting tenure, right? You do disciplinary work for a while, get the safety of tenure, and then you move off into interdisciplinary directions. NSF wanted to see that happen much sooner and to give graduate students an opportunity to do that kind of work as well. So we had a project at University of Idaho that required teams of graduate students to work together, start to finish, during their PhD tenure. These were interdisciplinary teams. So a team might consist of an ecologist and a hydrologist and a rural sociologist, for example. This project focused on biodiversity conservation and sustainable agriculture and fragmented landscapes. And so you would have natural resource experts. They had to find ways to integrate their perspectives. And for graduate students, that was extraordinarily difficult. And it turned out that philosophy was honestly the relevance of philosophy to this was something the graduate students brought.
And my recollection was that they came to you and said, this is impossible, help. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, the graduate students, again, were asked to do this really difficult job. They had to identify an overarching research problem that was relevant to each of their disciplinary domains. Write a dissertation on an aspect of that problem that allowed them to keep one foot anchored in their discipline while the other foot was anchored in this interdisciplinary project. And a key feature of this was that they had to write an article together and publish it that would show up as a chapter in all of their dissertations. So same chapter, 4 different dissertations, and it had to be integrated into each dissertation as well as across. This is a high bar for integrative performance. And while my colleagues were wonderful interdisciplinary investigators, figuring out how to communicate and train graduate students to do this kind of work more or less out of the gate while you're in graduate school proved to be very, very difficult. And a couple of graduate students who had been trained at the liberal arts colleges thought that maybe philosophy could help, that maybe because philosophy provides abstract perspective on knowledge systems, maybe philosophy could help. So I was invited by the PIs to team teach a interdisciplinary seminar that focused on philosophical issues in interdisciplinary research.
And so, long story short, you then ended up building this toolbox.
Right.
So talk about the toolbox and what that does.
Yeah.
Talk about the early one, and then we'll move on to the later one.
Sure. So we had this seminar, and we decided that what we wanted to do was come up with a pragmatic tool that the graduate students could use to address their issue. And this was 2005, and we read the literature and identified the power of dialogue to help bring different perspectives together, and thought that maybe what we could do is we could figure out a way to take philosophical dimensions of the interdisciplinary work they were doing together and use those dimensions to structure conversations among collaborators so that they would quickly, hopefully, be able to identify ways in which they're similar and ways in which they're different. So they'd be able to find common ground they shared as scientists or science students that they could leverage in producing integrated knowledge products. And so we developed this approach that we call the toolbox dialogue method. And then the early one was really driven from the top down by philosophy. We had an epistemology. So the toolbox dialogue method is built around what looks like a survey. It looks like a survey instrument. We call it the toolbox instrument. It's not a survey for reasons we can get into, but it has prompts, and the prompts basically orient the team that's participating in the toolbox workshop to issues that they share in common. They're important scientific issues around reductionism or hypotheses or confirmation or values or advocacy. So issues about which the collaborators will have opinions, but may have very different opinions. And so we developed this initial instrument, this toolbox instrument, from the top down. We had an epistemology half, so basically what must we be like that we can come to know about the world, and then a metaphysics half, which was what must the world be like that we can know about it. Right.
So I know you've moved on from there, but I actually found that to be a very powerful tool. And so I asked, so what you would do is Brett and I were in the same team. We would each answer the question, do you believe research is hypothesis driven? And you might say yes, and I might say no.
Yeah.
And then what do you do with that
So if you're collaborating, if you're a team, right, and you're trying to find ways of communicating about your scientific perspective with each other, knowing, for instance, about the role that hypotheses play in how you conceive of your work could be really important to me as your colleague and collaborator. There was an early group that participated in one of these workshops and had a conversation about hypotheses in particular. One of the students, this is a graduate student team, one of the students had just kind of come to know science as hypothesis testing. This was just what it was, right? And so when her colleague, who was a hydrologist, said, well, I don't think of what I do that way. I don't think in terms of hypotheses. She was, I mean, her jaw like almost hit the table, right? It was a moment that proved to be really important in the history of that team. Not the least, for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons was that as she pointed out, if they were going to publish something in a journal that made a difference to her, they were going to have to put it in terms of hypotheses. Whereas that wasn't as an issue really for her collaborator, but using the rhetoric of hypotheses testing was going to be critical to getting the word out to her community about their collaborative work. And so that, being able to figure that out early on, that might be a difference that could make a difference in their team's collaboration was a really important moment for them.
So the tool allows people to have those conversations, surfaces those differences, right? Allows people to then have those conversations. So let me move you on to how it then developed. So that's much broader now, right? And so can you talk about that? And can you also say something about unacknowledged differences, which is unacknowledged differences?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Where we're going.
Yeah, thank you. So we thought initially that maybe what we could do is build one toolbox, and that would work for everybody, like the one toolbox to rule them all sort of approach. And we had this sort of epistemology side and the metaphysics side. The epistemology side was like mapped from where you started to the methods you used during your process to where you concluded. Like, so we had a motivation section, which kind of got at the beginning where you began your project, a methodology section, and then a confirmation section. That was the epistemology half. So that we thought tracked a pretty natural way of thinking about investigation that wasn't tied down to any disciplinary domain. Metaphysics was more directly related to the literature. We had a section on objectivity and on values and reductionism and emergence. It turned out very quickly that we realized this instrument didn't resonate for everybody. So the idea that one toolbox could rule them all, that idea became we were disabused of that very quickly, that was going to work. So that led us, after a couple of years of doing this, to realize that we needed to design these instruments from the bottom up, that we needed to try to meet the teams we're working with where they're at and identify what issues they had that might get in the way of communication and collaboration.
So by now we've moved on from student teams to research teams. So even though the toolbox was clunky, it resonated with the community and it got immediate uptake. So
yeah, we early on, so we published a paper in Bioscience in 2007 with our graduate students out of the seminar. So we wrote a paper with our students and put it in Bioscience, and then NSF funded us right away to develop this idea and explore its potential. And it became, we started working with lots and lots of graduate student teams around the country, but we also started working with teams of researchers and academic, like faculty members and so forth. We moved into the public health direction initially and started working with public health teams. And we realized we had to think differently about what issues needed discussed in those contexts. Nowadays, we we basically we're inclined to write a new instrument for each team. Right, so we recognize that each team is going to have its own communication challenges, and in order to do justice to those challenges, we need to find out more detail about them in order to create a useful toolbox experience. You mentioned unacknowledged differences. This is how we think of what we're doing these days. So if you're working on a cross-disciplinary team, transdisciplinary team, or interdisciplinary team, you know you're different from your collaborators, but you don't necessarily know how you're different. I mean, the whole point is difference, right? The whole point is putting people together who have different perspectives. You're all trained to be experts in your domain, where that means you're trained to have certain things become salient for you and other things recede into the background. Turns out, of course, that if you're trained in this one, if you have discipline A, somebody trained in discipline B, what gets foregrounded for them might be very different than what gets foregrounded for you. But you're not necessarily aware of that, right? In becoming an expert, you're not also educated in how your expertise differs from everybody else's. And so we call this the problem of unacknowledged differences. You know you're different from one another, but you don't know how. And the key thing to efficient and effective cross-disciplinary communication is that you coordinate across those differences. You really need to develop mutual understanding of how you're different from one another. And the toolbox dialogue method is focused on creating sort of surgical opportunities to disclose and discuss the salient differences among experts.
Right. So one of the things that is really exciting is that the NSF now contracts Michael and his team to work with teams that have been funded, even a first tranche of funding, so that they learn how to work together so that they can write a proper integrated proposal. And so I guess what I'm trying to point out is A, we've got this great tool, B, it's really been taken up in the US, which is a great tick to have. I want to open it up for questions in a minute, but before I do that, this is a facilitated tool and it's facilitated by your team. Have you thought about how to make it more whether people can use it themselves? Is that something that you're doing?
Yeah, we've published. So we're the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, which is the group that runs these workshops and develops these workshops, is a research group in addition to a facilitation group. So we run workshops, collect data. Those data are fed into our research. The research then informs the workshops. So we try to kind of keep this going. Like that's the sort of engine of our effort. And we published quite a lot of research over the years, including 3 or so different discussions of what you might call a do-it-yourself toolbox. A paper in 2014, a couple of parts of a book that we published in 2020 and we've also developed with NSF support a graduate curriculum around the toolbox method for environmental science graduate programs. That all of these are really kind of written with the intention of providing the reader with the information they would need to run a workshop on their own, right? So we put into the public domain quite a few instances of the toolbox instrument, and also quite a lot of information about how we might run a workshop if you were to work with us. So yeah.
So one of the things that's really very interesting about unacknowledged differences is that this is a space where a lot of people make a lot of money. So if you think of Melbourne team roles or there's a whole lot of tests, psychometric tests that you can do that kind of point those differences out. And one of the things that kind of really interests me is why there's a market for that. There's not a market for much else that we do, but there's a real market for that. Anyway, I'll just let that question hang. What we've done is talked about difference and plurality, and we've talked about teamwork. And I want to move on to integration in a minute, but let me open it up for questions of what we've talked about so far. And people who've come forward, is that because you can't hear properly?
Oh, no, just to
just to be.
Have a
just to be-
better physical.
You look like
basis
you want
for
to ask the
conversation.
question, so.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
The people online can hear you, you better.
Also, I had Kayla's head in the way, so that's why I
Right.
Yeah, so as I said, I'm kind of on my own completely, and my thesis turns out to be, according to my supervisor, transdisciplinary rather than cross-disciplinary. So I did my own reading. My impression is that the difference is that me being one person, and I'm looking at a particular problem. I don't have a hypothesis, I don't have a research question. I'm observing to start with, and I thought that was a characteristic of transdisciplinary research. So I'm basically coming much more from the bottom in a way, but I'm the whole top myself. So it's kind of peculiar. And
Was there a question?
sorry? Yeah, the question is, what's your view on the difference between cross and trans? And does it have to do with top, bottom, up
Good, yeah.
ideas?
So I appreciate that. We were talking earlier that I'm as a philosopher, I have an appreciation for definitions and for just, you know, ways of marking differences among concepts. And I think this is a good question, right? So how does cross-disciplinarity relate, for me at least, to transdisciplinarity? When I use that term cross-disciplinary, I use it as a kind of generic cover term for transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity. It has, over the decades that it's been used, it has been used in different ways. But I would argue that the dominant way in which it's being used today is in this sort of generic fashion, right? The interdisciplinary, that term was sometimes used precisely and specifically, and sometimes used generically, and that got confusing. And I think a lot of people started looking around for some other term they could use for the general, you know, sort of way of crossing boundaries and crossing disciplinary boundaries. And that's the term that seems to be the one that's dominant right now.
Yeah.
So let's stay with definitions for a minute. So the question was really, is transdisciplinary one person pulling a whole lot of stuff together? I think so. Do you want to just talk about that, the different kinds of transdisciplinarity?
Sure. Is that so?
Yeah, I'm very invested in that question, of course, because I have to defend to everybody that I seem to be doing all these diverse things, and how can there be one problem, one project, one PhD, basically? How can that be that it comes together? And to me, it's natural, it's on me, but for other people, it's not. They see the differences that are not acknowledged normally, I guess.
Yeah,
Did you want to throw something in there?
Could I just throw something in? Thank you. No, and I think Susan's in an invidious position, because I think with funding issues and all the rest that we know about, there's much more pressure to specialise and to really narrow your focus. So I think historically we're at a difficult time as well with funding, and I really value what Susan's trying to do, but the environment, I don't think, supports it very well, particularly now.
thank you.
Yes, yeah.
I'm actually curious what you think about this too. It's when people are careful about this type of integrative research, they acknowledge that it can be practiced by individuals and it can be, you know, be practiced by teams. I tend to focus, and we tend to focus in our work on collaborative efforts, right? But obviously, you know, individuals can do the boundary crossing, disciplinary integration that teams are also interested in doing. It's not, at least to my knowledge, discussed very often. Individual transdisciplinary work, where that involves bringing together academic perspectives and maybe perspectives from outside the academy, like possibly indigenous perspectives or community perspectives. That's often transdisciplinarity is intended to mark the combination of inputs from inside and outside of academia. It's not often discussed. Individual transdisciplinarity like that is not,
No,
you don't
exactly.
find it discussed in the literature much. You do find individual interdisciplinary work where it's combinations of academic disciplines.
Mhm.
But the transdisciplinarity is often, almost always talked about collaboratively, at least in my experience. I'm not sure if you'd agree with that, but.
Well, the French school, which is looking for unity of knowledge, would allow for one person, but I don't want to spend a lot more time on this. I think, I want to keep, what we'll do now is move on to integration, which will be more relevant to what both individuals and teams do. But let me just, I guess one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with Michael was to illustrate that there's some great tools for teams that want to work together. And that Michael's developed one of the best of us. And I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of what that tool is about. Any questions on that tool or on teamwork before we move on to integration, and then we can circle back to the sort of question that Susie's asked.
Yeah, I've got a question. So when you've been working with the research teams with the toolbox, I imagine it's something that happens that's front loaded to some extent, and then it probably peters out. What happens after?
So repeat the second part.
What happens after you've sort of worked with them?
Oh, good. Yeah. So
I'm sorry to the people online to move in your.
I forgive you.
So we've done we've engaged in relationships that have looked very different with respect to this question, right? A team contacts us, wants to work with us, wants to develop collaborative capacity using the toolbox dialogue method. We run a workshop with them, then what, right? And I think it's an important question for a couple of reasons. One, it's an important question because what are we doing? What are they doing to take advantage of any gains they make in the workshop itself, right? But also there's a kind of ethical dimension here, and this is something that it's important to acknowledge, right? You create an experience for a team in which that team is disclosing differences and discussing differences that carries with it some vulnerability, right? People need to be vulnerable with one another and kind of open to possibly changing how they're thinking about their common project, and that I think. That has an ethical side to it that requires, attention after the fact. At least maybe requires is too strong, but it could, entail a need for attention after the fact. And what we've done with most teams that we work with, we write reports based on data we collect in the workshop, and then the reports are delivered to the team. Often we will meet with the team to talk about the reports, or the reports are used to structure reflection, downstream reflection with the team, within the team. We also work with teams longitudinally. So we've had a number of relationships with partners where we would run a workshop and then we reflect with them about that experience, design a second workshop, maybe 8 months to a year later, and then just repeat the process, in some cases several times, like 4 or 5 times. Those are really rewarding experiences for us because we have an opportunity to pay close attention to the kinds of changes that the team makes on the basis of what they learn in these conversations. But probably the primary vehicle for downstream impact that we've relied on is the report. That leverages our experience and also our observations during the workshop.
Did you have anything you wanted to throw in?
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Just hang on. People online can hear you. Don't speak into the microphone.
Need 2 microphones.
Talk to you.
I'm just curious, what's the specific methods you're using to develop this toolbox to transdisciplinary research?
Sorry, that was the question about the specific.
You're going to
methods.
have to help me with this. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I have hearing loss, so I wear hearing aids, and so can be a struggle sometimes.
So this was a question about the specific methods that you use to develop the toolbox.
Very good. So, these days, what we do is we'll work. So let's say you're a member of a team and you contact me and we start working together. Well, one of the first thing we'll do is spend some time learning about what you're doing as a team. Say, what is your project? What is, so we might read papers that you've written. We might read papers you provide us with that give us background. If you're willing to share, if it's a funded proposal, or a funded project, and you're willing to share your proposal, we'll read the proposal. So the initial step is to spend some quality time immersing ourselves in the space where your team is functioning. The second part is often an information gathering stage or data collection stage, where we might put a survey together that we distribute to your team that helps us get clear on where the differences are that your teammates have kind of encountered between themselves and your collaborators. And then once we have, so we have information about the theme you're working on, we have information about the relational dynamic of your team, then we'll start designing the instrument. And so we write prompts and we'll typically write what we call a superset of prompts, like just lots and lots of prompts. And we'll do this with you. And, so that would be the initial step. And then we would send that to you and you would go through it and you say, nah, this isn't work. This doesn't work. You'd like cancel, cross a few out. You might add a few, you might modify the language. And we'd iterate back and forth like this 2 or 3 times, until we have a set of prompts that we're both confident would generate dialogue that would be valuable for your team. One way to think about the design process for a toolbox instrument is in terms of reverse engineering. So we ask you to think, what would a productive dialogue with your team look like? What topics would you like to see your team having a conversation about? What are some important dimensions or characteristics of that dialogue? And then once we have a clear picture of that, we reverse engineer the instrument to try to get your team to that spot, right? So that's another influence in the process of designing the prompts. We're going to make some decisions about which ones to keep and which ones to cross out based on our sense of whether they can get your team to the place you want them to be at the end of the workshop.
Heather, are there any questions online?
Yep.
Yeah, so let's do online and then we'll come back to
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Gabriele.
Okay. So Peter would like to ask a question about transdisciplinary teamwork and the problem that a part of the human consciousness are personality disorder. So the question is that is maladaptive pattern of behavior and experiences such as narcissism, paranoia, etc., which can do great damage to that collaborative activity. He's interested in about how you may have thought about or make a technique that sits within something like the toolbox method, for where you have one or more people on the team with routinely active personality disorders.
Yeah, all right. One
That's
or
a hard
more.
question.
Yeah.
So
Thanks, Peter.
it's important, I think, to acknowledge that there are actually a number of different tools and approaches that are evidence-informed, at least if not evidence-based, emerge from research that help collaborative teams function more efficiently and effectively. So toolbox dialogue method is one example, but there are other examples that are discussed in the literature that of tools that I think can improve the prospects of success for a team, even teams that might include people who are challenging. One of the tools that I think that I would mention here, that if I found myself on a team like this, one of the tools that I would probably go to immediately is the collaboration agreement. this goes by different names: collaboration planning, collaboration agreement. There's a group, I think Howard, right, and Michelle call it collaboration prenup. Some kind of agreement that you put together as a team to make explicit norms and standards that you will subscribe to as collaborators in this team, right? So it's a way of, we like to think of it as a way of operationalizing transparency. You want your project to be transparent. You want your teammates in a project, a collaborative project, want to know where they stand, want to know what's expected of them, want to know how to be good teammates most of the time, right? But often that's a mystery. It's left mysterious because it's not made explicit. And a collaboration agreement can help by making explicit the norms and expectations that are part of being a member of that team. And so in this case, it seems to me that involving those individuals in the development of a collaboration plan could make it the case that, look, everybody now agrees this is how we're going to operate. And if we don't operate in this way, here's what we've agreed to by way of accountability, right? This is what accountability looks like if you don't subscribe to the norms that you yourself contributed to the development of, right? So that, I think that this is a difficult problem, but I think that's a way of maybe getting ahead of it a little bit.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that we leave time to talk about integration, and we're running out of time fast.
Right.
Are there more questions online?
No, thank you. Look, I have 50 comments and 20 questions, but I'll try to be brief. That this is so stimulating. But my question is about the toolbox. Does your toolbox include assistance for different discipline languages and symbols?
So I'm going to answer that, and you tell me if I'm misunderstanding the question.
Sure.
So what we would do if it turned out that, say, the team you were working on was struggling with communication across different technical languages, like the disciplinary languages, we're getting them
Precisely. Yes.
Then that would be an important design consideration in developing the instrument. And we'd work with you to try to write prompts that would create opportunities for the team to have conversations about those technical terms. One of the things we have over the years shied away from in facilitating these is providing a glossary or definitions of the terms in the instrument. If we've chosen the prompts well, and the term, we wordsmith these prompts a lot. So we pay attention to the words that the prompts that we use to write the prompts. But often we'll choose words that people will wonder, well, what do we mean by that? And our answer these days, the sort of go-to answer is, well, it's not what we would mean by that. Actually, doesn't matter. What's important is what you would mean by that. Right. And, the thing is, you work with these teams, they're all smart people. If you say, look, we're going to use this term in this way for the next 2 hours, you will use it in that way for the next 2 hours, even if you would never use it that way outside of the workshop. So we want to shy away from norming the language ourselves, and instead try to invite them to say, well, here's how I'd use it. And then somebody else might say, what? Right. And that's where the action is. That's where you start really making progress.
Yeah, we can have a long conversation on that. I do want to spend some time on integration, because I know that's what you're talking about. One of the things you're working on now.
Okay.
So tell us about the IPO model of integration, and this will be particularly useful.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So one of the things that's emerged from the research that we do on the toolbox dialogue method, and then the research that's informed by the data that we collect from these workshops, is we've done quite a bit of work on integration. So what the combination of disciplinary perspectives into a more complex whole, right? So if you're doing transdisciplinary work, what you're trying to do is you're trying to weave together or integrate somehow different ways of thinking about the same issue, right? And people use the term integrate all the time, but it's not often the case that it gets defined or it gets articulated in any kind of, precise way. So what we've tried to do is propose and develop a model that we call the IPO model. It's input, process, output model of integration. That's related to work that has been done on the IPO model in cognitive psychology, or at least informed by work that's been done in cognitive psychology. The goal of the model is, it's not to reveal anything surprising about integration, right? The fact that integration is a process is, almost a universally received opinion. And so if it's a process, then it's probably got inputs and an output, right? Or inputs and outputs. So this is not surprising to anybody. But working out the details and identifying the constraints that a cross-disciplinary integration process will need to respect in order to be successful, that's much more complicated. I think our goal with this is twofold. One, we'd like to contribute to the theory of interdisciplinarity so that we can advance a more systematic way of thinking about what it is we're doing when we try to do this stuff. The other goal we have is to develop pragmatic tools, right? This is theory in service of practice, right? This is what we're all about, theory in service of practice. Develop pragmatic tools that we can integrate into these workshops to help people be more explicit and intentional about their integration. So you're an interdisciplinary project. You want to achieve integrative outcomes. What do you mean by that? How are you going to do that, right? There are other examples of things like logic models or theories of change that have been proposed that are along the same lines, right? We're talking about affecting systematically a series of changes that will take you from these inputs to these outputs. Can you be more explicit about what you're anticipating, right? And being intentional, developing infrastructure to support that intentionality, all of that can be, we would submit, helpful to a team in achieving cross-disciplinary success. So that's theory in service of practice. We want to take a model of integration and deliver it to people so that they can use it as a tool to make their lives easier.
So let me say this back to you and see if it's right.
Okay.
A lot of what you do is dialogue based. And what you're trying to do is really get people to think more clearly about what it is that they're doing. How do you move that beyond just the bleeding obvious?
I think that the bleeding obvious, by that you mean just the.
Well, so that, no, maybe the lowest common denominator, right?
Okay,
So
yeah.
what you're trying to do is you're trying to, on the one hand, yes, you're working on what people know.
Right.
But if you only ever work with what people know, you never progress, right? So how do you, is the argument that because lots of different people, and this is particularly relevant for Susie, if lots of people are doing it, then you're bringing together lots of people's what they know,
Yeah.
and that way you progress. But if one person's doing it, how do you get them to do better than what's more than just thinking about it? So it's a very inarticulate question. I'm hoping you get what I'm
effective.
Let me respond and see if this is on the right track. I think that a lot of the times we'll write toolbox instruments that contain prompts, which are you wouldn't look at them as provocative. You'd say, oh, okay, this is a prompt about, like, scientific research is hypothesis driven. It's like, some people are gonna look at that and say, duh, why are we talking about this? Because that's the most obvious thing I can imagine somebody saying about science, right? What moves it beyond the bleeding obvious are two things. One, the fact that reaction is countered by the reaction from people who will say, I don't think that's what science is. And then you have a opportunity for real dialogue, right? Somebody who thinks this is just obvious finds themselves collaborating with somebody who thinks, no, it's actually not even true, let alone obvious, right? The second thing that helps deepen these dialogues and make them help get below the surface is the fact that when people participate in them, they tell stories, they talk about their experiences. So almost always, especially engaged dialogues, they'll start with a prompt, they'll talk about how they responded to it. So in these instruments, the prompts are associated with rating response skills. Anyways,
I'm gonna stop you.
yeah,
Because we've gone back to teamwork, and and it seems to be using the same process with integration.
Yeah.
And how is it? I can see in teamwork that it's the unacknowledged difference that gives you the spark. What happens in the integrative process, the integrative dialogue process that gives you the spark? Is it exactly the same thing, or is there something more going on? In the IPO process. So when
right.
you're asking people to think about their inputs, their process, and everything else,
Okay.
what is it there that gives that depth and meaning and
Good. Okay. So let's see. Here's an example of a pragmatic context that we've used the IPO model in. So we working with a convergence team, and they just participated in a dialogue with us. And now we're doing a co-creation activity, which is a part of the workshop that leverages what's learned in the dialogue. And we asked them to think about their projects in a way that's informed by an analogy with biology. So we talk about integrative pathways and integrative mechanisms, so like biological pathways, biological mechanisms. And so now we introduce this analogy, and then we asked them to be explicit about what pathways they anticipate their project following, from its early in the life cycle to late in the life cycle. And then so they're forced, that invites them anyway to think about inputs. So what are we starting with? And outputs, which are often specified in, say, a proposal as project objectives. But often what isn't discussed is how you're supposed to get from here to there, right? And so that's, if you put that in front of folks and say, okay, so now fill in the middle and think in terms of mechanisms, things that you're going to use, tools to help bring those inputs into relations that will produce the outputs you hope to achieve. And we found that way of thinking about it is really productive, in that the teams will begin to identify the integrative moments they anticipate experiencing in the project.
so the spark is you. The spark is your careful thinking about what this team needs and your ability to give them something, to find a way to connect with them and to give them a tool that they can move on with. And I don't think that should be underestimated, because that then makes it really hard for the do-it-yourself teams, right? Because they will regress to the lowest common denominator. They won't. They're very unlikely to have the person who's going to have that ability to really think about what this team needs.
Can I react to that?
You can't see my face. It's under the mask, right?
I think that's right. I think that if the process is pursued effectively, what we're trying to create are scaffolds that put people close to, like, insights. The toolbox instrument, these prompts are intended to kind of get people close to differences so they can start to appreciate them. They start to identify them. Same within IPO model. The IPO model can be used as a kind of scaffold to get them thinking a certain way about their project. Ultimately, it's not up to us. It's not about us. If they don't do the work, they don't tell the right story, if they don't lean into it, then it's probably 2 hours wasted. But yeah, I think our job is we're kind of like, we think of ourselves kind of like Dawsons. We're gonna put you in, like take you on a trip and put you close to a lot of really cool things, and then we've engineered this experience for you. And ultimately, if you're going to derive real value from it, there's work you have to do as well. right? You have to observe
Yeah.
similarities and differences, and you have to reflect on your own experience, on your own values and beliefs, and be vulnerable with colleagues, and where that might not be easy in some cases.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've undersold yourselves. Of course, the other side has to engage, but I think you've undersold what you do. That this has been really important for me, because what I'm interested in is the expertise that's involved.
Yeah, right.
And it's
Yeah,
how to bottle the expertise.
Oh, there's,
into
yeah,
green,
yeah,
right?
that's right.
I'm going to open it up for questions for the last 5 minutes. Carla, is there anything online?
Not yet.
No? Questions? You went last time. Do you want to go first this time?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Lovely, a 3-hour discussion coming up the time, but no, very valuable. It's something I've grappled with, and again, like I said, many comments, but fascinated. My background, I'm a molecular biologist, so I was most happiest in the lab, smelling the buffers and micropipettes and all the rest of it in white coat. So very much that hypothesis-driven approach. You form a hypothesis, you test it, etc. That's a scientific method in my head. You're quite correct. However, I'm now in the School of Epidemiology and Population Health, and all my work now, and now I've lost my train of thought. And now it's computational. Anyway, my question is, what I've come to, I've really struggled with this, where you set hypotheses or not observational. Is there room, or is I suppose, a solution to that quandary or that conundrum of whether you're doing hypothesis driven or not, that your work is hypothesis generating?
I think that, so one thing that we find people in these conversations relying on is the relationship between hypotheses and research questions, right? So it's not uncommon to see teams sort of move in the direction of talking about their work framed by research questions, right? And that's something that has, at least in our experience, I think it seems to be more inclusive of different perspectives. So engineering perspectives and certain other kinds of scientific perspectives that may not be grounded as much in hypotheses, right? Or they may not use the rhetoric of hypothesis to talk about what they do as much. But research questions seems neutral enough as a way of kind of framing.
Okay.
Yeah. And so hypothesis generated, I don't know. I think to a lot of folks, the word hypothesis is loaded for reasons that I think you pointed to, right? That people are trained at a certain point in primary school to think that this is the scientific method, right? And that, anyway.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yep, maybe I can just contribute something really short to that. I have been thinking about this conundrum as well a lot, and I have an alternative rhetoric about this. It's about finding patterns, or I'm an artist as well, making patterns, interrupting the patterns, finding the outliers. So maybe that helps bridging.
Yeah, an intervention.
Yeah, that's good too. I like that.
Yeah, thank you.
Chris, any other comments?
Yes. So one question. Do you feel that in your work on integration that you have a great grip on the incommensurability of the theories, and the way that scientific and stakeholder community come with certain wallpapers in ontologies and epistemologies? And if yes, how are you doing it?
Enough 2 hours.
I didn't really get that.
Okay, so this is, how are you dealing with incommensurable theories of integration and other incommensurabilities? So between the ideas of integrate, I think the ideas of the stakeholders and the disciplines who might be incommensurable. So how do you deal with incommensurability?
Right. How do you do that? So, I guess my inclination right now, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is to to think of incommensurability as signaling some kind of conflict between let's imagine we're talking about inputs in an integrative process being incommensurable with one another. And then that there's something about the inputs relative to what one's integrative goals might be that makes it impossible for those to be integrated. Maybe that's a strong way of interpreting incommensurability. But I'm at least open, I guess, to the possibility that some things can't be integrated. Right, and that there might be a need to modify an input in order to render it commensurable with another input. There might be a need to change inputs in some way to facilitate the integration process. But I can't, I'm definitely open to the idea that strong incommensurability might entail the failure of integration in a particular case.
So I'm mindful that we're on time, but we're happy to keep going for a little bit longer. But those of you who need to leave, feel free to leave. We won't take it as a sign of rudeness. Chris, I'm going to give you a question.
Yeah, thanks.
I need to call my son, but I'll be back.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Okay. During Gabrielle's questions, we got to a point where you were like the expertise around integration. And I was curious as to whether you thought that it's the fact that you're external to the group that might be the thing that allows you to be integrative, or whether it's the expertise. And yeah, I'd be interested.
It's an important question. So make sure, let me just repeat it. So you're asking about the fact that when we work with a group, we're not members of the group.
Yeah.
Right. And that would be, this is a difference that we've noted between sort of do-it-yourself toolboxes and the kinds of toolbox experiences that we run. Often the do-it-yourself toolbox will be kind of facilitated by somebody on the inside, right? A project leader or somebody who's interested in the method. And that can have implications for how open people are willing to be in dialogue. And I do think that the fact that we're external, that allows us to kind of set back and be a little bit maybe more, I wouldn't say, what's the right word, maybe
Dispassionate.
yeah, thank you, it's passionate. Yeah, and I think that helps in also writing reports for the team. The team can be confident that the report we've written isn't going to be perhaps biased in a way that might reflect our prior connection with the group. So I do think there are advantages to being external. There are disadvantages though too, right? I mean, the reality is we might walk into a situation and be unaware of some problem, like the first question online, right? That there might be some serious communication issues or interpersonal dynamic issues that actually could be damaging in a context like this, and we might not be aware of those, right? So that could undermine our ability to facilitate the workshop effectively, right? So sometimes being an insider, I think, can give you information that's going to be really helpful. But sometimes it's good to be coming in from the outside.
The question, what I thought you were going to say was, you're also not setting yourself up as the experts on integration. There's a dance that you do, right? That you're confident enough about what integration is, but you're open enough to help. So do you want to just talk about that for a minute?
And yeah, if that was your question,
no, I don't think it was.
But it is an interesting question.
I think that let me see if I can respond to that. So it's true that we don't set ourselves up as experts in these sessions. Typically, we give a preamble at the beginning, so it's about 15-minute introduction to the toolbox dialogue method, who we are and what to expect in the next 2 hours, that sort of thing. But often we rely on the endorsement of like project leaders or others to motivate the participants to care about the experience, right? We need buy-in. If these workshops don't work if people aren't bought into them. So that's, you know, somebody gets cut off in traffic on the way to the workshop and they're angry and they can just sabotage a workshop, right? So we need buy-in. We don't try to generate buy-in by claiming expertise. Instead, what we try to do is generate buy-in by claiming, by receiving an endorsement. Like, we think the leader says, I think this is really important. We need to do this. And then we're brought in, right? But one of the things that our experience and our expertise when it comes to integration does for us, though, is it does help us along the way in a workshop identify moments where a comment from a facilitator can be instrumental in helping make a connection, right? So that, you know, I think along the way, if we do our job as facilitators, we can also enhance people's excitement about the experience and generate even more buy-in as we go.
It's a really interesting dance.
Yeah, so, but it's critical that it not be about us, right? We try to stay back and not be because, you know, again, we're not parts of the team, we're not a part of the team. So, you know, they need to be doing the hard work, not us. We did all our work ahead of time.
And yet you also publish about the expertise of doing it. So you
Yeah.
publish about process and expertise. I am going to wrap this up because Carla, you need to go back to work. People are welcome to stay if you want to chat a bit more, but Carla, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Were there any last questions online?
Nope, they said thank you as well.
Okay, thank you. So thanks everybody, and thanks in particular, Michael.
Thanks, everybody.